Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young, and I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, and welcome to our online forum. It's delightful to have you tonight. Berdis Baldwin, Alberta King, Louise Little. Virtually nothing has been said about these extraordinary women until now. The fundamental belief in equal justice and dignity came above all else for the three mothers of James, Martin Luther, and Malcolm. Tonight, we're continuing to celebrate Mother's Day with the stories of the three women who raised and shaped some of America's most pivotal heroes. My guest tonight is Malaika Tubbs, a Cambridge Ph.D. candidate in sociology and a Bill and Melinda Gates scholar with a BA in anthropology from Stanford and a master's from the University of Cambridge in multidisciplinary gender studies. Her first book, which came out in February, is The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of MLK Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped a Nation. Thank you so much for joining us, Anna, tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I've been enjoying your book so much. I feel like I spent the last, 10 hours with you because I've been reading it so carefully. And it's been a delight for me to read about these mothers, these extraordinary figures. And I'm very grateful for you for putting it all together. It must have been a huge task.
Here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really, really good to see you. I was wondering, I was thinking as I was reading it, it was Mother's Day. I was wondering how you got the idea for this project. Like when did you first think of putting these three amazing women together?
Yeah, so it was a couple years ago, really, when I was starting my PhD. I was really inspired by Margot Lee Shetterly's Hidden Figures. And for those who haven't read the book, they've probably at least heard of the movie. And I left the theater as well as that book feeling very inspired, but also incredibly frustrated because I was aware that it wasn't a mistake that the names of these Black women had been kept from history. It was intentional to hide them in order to fit whatever patriarchal notion of who the heroes and who the leaders are of our stories. And so I knew I wanted to be somebody who addressed the erasure of Black women's stories. I wanted to find other hidden figures as well. So when I started my PhD, that was my main goal. And there were so many stories that I could tell, but I also wanted to highlight motherhood. I think it's a role in our society that's so often overlooked, unrecognized, uncelebrated. So I could also celebrate moms while also thinking about fighting the erasure of Black womanhood. And then I decided on these three because we so often come back to the civil rights movement in all of our discourse, whether that's in policy or in education, so many different ways. We're always talking about the civil rights movement, really thinking about how what we're doing right now is aligning with what our civil rights heroes had in mind for us. But we often only speak about it from the perspective of men and our male leaders. And there was so much more to be said about people who participated in the movement, but even the generation right before the civil rights movement and how that contributes to this moment in history, so that we remember it's not this thing that just happened all of a sudden, but instead it's connected to something so much larger and years of fighting for freedom. And I said, okay, great, that's the project. I'm going to talk about the mothers of leaders of civil rights. And I wanted to talk about these three because they were all born within 6 years of each other, Alberta, Burtis, and Louise. And then their famous sons were all born within 5 years of each other. And it gave me a perfect opportunity to think about American history through their eyes. And each chapter is shaped around 10 years of their lives and progresses chronologically in that way, where we also see what's happening in the United States with each World War, the Great Depression, the Harlem Renaissance, the beginning of the Great Migration, and now we get to see it through their perspective.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, I when I was 21 or 22, that was the year I read Autobiography of Malcolm X. I read James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain, and I read Let the Trumpet Sound, which was kind of a new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. I think they were really I was in my 20s. I was trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do with my life. And I went to these three figures, and I didn't even it didn't even occur to me that there was a theme to them all until I started reading your book. I mean, but all three of them had preachers as fathers, but their mothers were really the ones who were like the most had such extraordinary educations and such extraordinary life experiences.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can tell us just kind of like a short summary of each woman's life and impact, because they were all just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I say quite often when I started writing the book and doing the research. I wasn't trying to prove anything in terms of because Alberta did this, MLK did this, or because Louise did this, Malcolm did this, and so forth. But what was really surprising for me was that you couldn't even if you were trying not to do that, you couldn't write it that way because it was so obvious, the connections between the moms and their sons. As soon as you learned anything about them, every single detail that I picked up, I said, wow, this is so clear now why the son ends up doing this later on. And so as a teaser for that, Alberta King was a woman. Oh, sorry, say that again.
I just got to interrupt you because that was, I mean, do you know how it's like something's, someone tells you something and you're like, that was so obvious.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't I know that? I mean, why didn't I know that? Or that's what I kept turning every page.
And that's what this book, that book, that's what this book does. You feel like as you're reading it, and we don't even hear the sons' names until, like chapter 3 or 4. But it's those first 3 chapters, you're still, if you're a fan of any of these men, you're going to start to see them, even though as for the women, they're not even thinking of having children yet, but all the things that they're doing, the passions and talents that they're forming, it is such an obvious connection to the men that we so revere. And so with Alberta King, she is somebody who believes that faith cannot be faith without social justice, that you must, if you're a religious leader, always fight for the oppressed, use your privileges to advance freedom causes forward. She and her parents participate in marches and in boycotts, and they're some of the first members of the NAACP. So the only difference really between what she does and what her son does later is that he calls it nonviolence. But outside of that, it's the exact same tactics, the exact same strategies that his maternal lineage has been perfecting for years. When we think about Louise Little, she is somebody who was inspired by her grandparents, who were what we call liberated Africans, meaning at one point they were enslaved, and with changing laws, they were able to gain their freedom. And because of this, they held so tightly to their independence, to the importance of self-sufficiency, the importance of professing Black pride. So Louise uses her own education, her own talents to join an international movement for Black lives, which was the Marcus Garvey movement. And for those that aren't familiar with the Marcus Garvey movement, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the Nation of Islam, very professing Black pride, as well as anti-white assimilation and standing up for yourself by any means necessary. These are all of the things that we revere Malcolm X for. And again, it's really directly related to Louise Little and even her grandparents. And then when we think about Berdis Baldwin, she was a writer. She believed that you could help people through their own pain, through the darkness, letting them let go of hatred, so that they could find healing and they could find forward movement. This mattered so much to her. So she would give her loved ones letters that helped them change their perspective on the world and what they were going through, as well as what they were witnessing in the country. And then her son, again, becomes the writer, James Baldwin, and he calls himself a witness to the power of light. And so it became so clear for me in all of the details I was able to find how, again, the erasure of these women was not a mistake. It was very intentional, because you really can't know these men without knowing the mothers. And that's the feeling that most people have told me they feel when they read the book. Like you said, how did we not know this sooner? It's such an obvious thread that runs through their lives.
And, in some ways, it's just like, it's kind of like related to American individualism. I mean, and part of it, I mean, and maybe it's just like me trying to remember something from a long time ago in my life. But, you think of Malcolm X being converted in prison and taking on this huge reading discipline. All the stuff, though, was from his mom and his parents. You're exactly right to say that they are so deeply influenced, especially by their mothers. I kept thinking as I was reading it and wondering, I mean, you're entering a new phase in your life and you're going to be so busy with so many things. But I mean, if somebody said, I'm going to give you a grant for 3 years to go and study in whatever libraries you need to study, I wonder which of these 6 figures you'd want to invest more time into, what you feel like you have, like kind of, it may be because there's more material on one, or it may be because one sparked your imagination, but which of the 3 sons or mothers would you want to like devote more of your life to?
It's so interesting because with this book, my goal wasn't necessarily to be, the only person that spoke about these three women, but instead to really make a claim for the role that these mothers played in their children's lives, a general kind of theoretical assertion. We need to understand more stories and Black women's stories and mothers' stories, and we just need to put them out there. And so one of the things that has come up, I've been very spoiled by positive reviews, so I really can't complain. But the few that don't like the book is because they want more details on the women. And there wasn't much out there already before this book, like anything out there. But the reason that I said I'm ready to put this out there, even though there's so much more left that I think we maybe could uncover, is that I want to make this claim so that more people do this research with me. So funnily enough, I feel very almost complete in my journey with learning about these three women or finding the facts and uncovering the facts. But I want more people in reading it to feel that we can write more books about them. With the men, there are new books out about them every single year. And it's not usually one person who wrote several books.
Right.
It's all these different perspectives that have come around this one person. And I find that to be really beautiful. And I think it's something that these three women deserve as well. And so I'm very proud to be the first person to introduce them to the world, but I don't necessarily have a feeling of, I really want to go back and continue to find this. There's something in me that really is ready to also explore many other stories, and many other motherhood stories, especially. There's so many figures that I think we can celebrate. And so I think this is a beginning for Alberta, Burtis, and Louise. But I don't yet in my heart feel, like I have to go back.
And you can always see what happens in the future. And the other thing is, in a way, it's funny, as you're talking, it's almost like a fourth character in the book. It's just like this racist context of 20th century North American racism and how damaging and how destructive of human souls it is. It's just almost like everything that went wrong in any of those characters' lives is so related to racism. And I wonder if you can talk, some of the stories you tell are so horrifying. And I can imagine that as you're doing the research, you're like hearing even more horrifying things. And I wonder what you do with that too. It's just like, did you go through sections where you're just like, I can't sleep at night? And like, what do you do with that pain and that suffering? Just kind of personally, as somebody who's kind of a witness to it as a scholar.
Yeah. The primary, I would say, kind of center of this book is talking about the dehumanizing treatment that Black mothers have faced throughout American history, and how, despite that, we have humanized ourselves and humanized our children and fought for our humanity, fought to be treated with dignity and with respect. And so at any moment when there's that pain and there's that violence and there's that grief, it's always followed by this fight for living and this reclamation of joy and happiness. And so I just had to keep reminding myself of that balance, because it was important to me to represent Black women with that complexity, with that humanity and our wholeness, that it wasn't just grief all the time. It wasn't just pain, that these attacks waged against us were very real, but that didn't conquer us, that we weren't conquered victims, but instead we're always professing our agency. And so it's this like constant back and forth kind of tug of war that happens. So I knew in those moments when I'm detailing these atrocities that was necessary. I needed to do that. I couldn't hide that. I couldn't keep that out of the narrative. But I was hoping that even for those of us who have heard stories like this, or we've said, people knew how terrible Jim Crow was, or we say it all the time, that we become so used to it that we don't really sit in the pain of that because we're not connecting it to human narrative. Versus when you get to know Alberta, Burtis, and Louise, and you're walking through the world in their shoes, when these things happen now, you start to feel it more deeply. And so I knew that was important. That kind of vulnerability to share with my reader was very important. And also a constant reminder of the fight continues, the fight for freedom continues, the fight for liberation and for life continues. And here's how we're going to keep witnessing this as the book progresses.
Yeah, I kept thinking of your kind of introduction where you're talking about your own learning that you're becoming a mother. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about what you learned about motherhood from these great figures, and then also just kind of like how like their lives is just kind of informed like how you're treating and handling motherhood, you know?
Yes, it's informed me in so many ways. When I started writing the book, I was not a mom yet. I was expecting my son, my firstborn, when I was in the middle of the research for the book, which was so powerful and such a gift to me. Because on top of the book, like I said before, I was writing the dissertation. So I was also diving very deep into maternal theory and the different ways in which different people approach motherhood, and the very empowering ways that Black feminists spoke about motherhood being this way of transforming the world, that every time one of our children is born, the world begins again. And it's passing on these lessons of liberation and freedom and system changing knowledge through our bodies and through our minds. So it's this motherhood view of being very powerful, very influential, very important, which was crucial when we're thinking about, often in our society, mothers, again, are not celebrated. They're not seen in this kind of power. They're not seen in this kind of influence. Instead, it's almost as if mothers are treated as second-class citizens who have to give up their own needs and really just be there for everybody else. And it can be a very inhumane feeling that a lot of mothers have expressed, especially while on this book tour. And I've had so many conversations. So many moms felt like finally someone saw the power of their role and the importance of it. And that's not just to say, let's, clap for moms. We deserve to put more spotlight on them. It's also to say that this really directly translates into policy decisions and how we're doing as a nation. If we don't have supports around moms because we don't see their role to be that important, there's a problem there. Versus when we start to recognize moms are really keeping so many things going. And without them, what would we do? We couldn't do anything. And therefore, there should be more policy in place that respects that role, whether that's through parental leave or even having universal childcare so that mothers can go back to school if they want to, or feel ready to go back to work, or for, to be able to breathe for a second and relax. Whatever that is that mothers could do if they had more supports in place and everything wasn't falling on their shoulders. So it was also a dialogue between what was happening currently in the way we treat mothers, the way we treat Black women. So that was a big part of it for me. Thinking through how I was going to be as a mom, I felt very empowered. And I think that empowerment is something that a lot of us need to have the energy to be moms, to be parents. It's a wonderful journey. It's such an incredible blessing, but it also can be very tiring. And if you don't see yourself in that power that you hold, it can be difficult to know, to have forgiveness with yourself even, or to extend yourself grace. Totally. Yeah. Instead, you're constantly blaming yourself for something that goes wrong, and you're carrying all the anxieties, and it's harder to enjoy the fun parts. So that was a big part of it, as well as the notion that I was very worried at first when I became pregnant and knew about the Black maternal health crisis. I was aware of the dangers of Black motherhood. It's what I've studied for so long. And so quickly, and I think, a lot of moms will relate to this feeling also of, you've never loved something so much, but you've also never been so worried before, so afraid that something could happen, that you're starting to imagine all these things that can happen, and the anxiety can really set in. And studying these moms, I felt like they were welcoming me with a really warm hug of, let's walk through this together. Here's how we did it in our sons' lives, our children's lives. They had many children, and be aware of what's what's happening in the world. You have to be aware. You can't be ignorant to the things that you're fearful of. That's a real feeling. That's valid, but you also can't accept it as if it's inevitable. These are not inevitable burdens that you'll have to carry. And here are ways that we can change systems around us, so that you can be more hopeful, and you can focus on the joy, and you can focus on the living part of it, which I found to be really beautiful. So it's influenced my motherhood in a lot of ways. My son's only 18 months old, so I have a lot, I'm a very, very new mom. I have another one on the way in August. So we will see. We'll see how they continue to teach me in my motherhood journey.
Oh, completely. And I love, it's just when at the kind of the, not the end of the book, but kind of the end of the narrative portion, you just talked about just how the mothers cared for, how the mothers cared for their sons when they were little, and what they needed, and what Malcolm X needed when he was a little boy and loved gardening, and what Martin Luther King loved when he just needed comfort from his mom, and how he wanted to go to school early. And, I love that part of it. I wonder if as you were talking, I was just thinking there's so many living relatives of these three women. I wonder if they're getting back to you, or like, are they calling you or sending you emails through your publisher? Or I guess eventually
it's been really cool. That's been such a cool part of it. When I was doing the research, I wanted them to at least know, I wanted the family members to know that I was writing this book. I didn't want it to seem like all of a sudden the book came out and then they were sort of like, what? This woman's been writing about our family, maybe sharing some personal details, etc., without us knowing. So my first goal in contacting them was just that they would be aware that this was a project I was working on. If they wanted to participate, I'd be honored to call them, interview them, meet them in person, whatever they wanted to do, whatever they were willing to share with me. But it's also important to keep in mind that they are families that are inundated with requests.
I can imagine. Yeah,
it's crazy. I can only imagine every single day how many people are writing to them and how difficult that is, especially because not always are these inquiries to respect, their loved ones who have passed. Again, we forget that Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and James Baldwin were human beings. They weren't like just these deities, or like what we think somehow that they were above humanity, or that they were just literary figures. They were people who had loved ones, who had children, who had moms and had dads and siblings, etc. So it's also a very painful thing for them to recount so much of what happened. And a lot of these inquiries are not necessarily to honor them, but sometimes, the scandal of what people are looking for. So all of that is to say, I was very conscious of how I was going to be when I reached out to them, and was very respectful of whatever they wanted. Some of them said, I don't want to be interviewed, but here is a good source for you. I'll refer you to this, the archival team, for instance, at the King Center. Or I'll talk, but only for 5 minutes. And I'm only going to say a few things, I'm going to be more reserved, or I'll talk to you, but I'm not going to tell you when I'm going to call you. So out of nowhere, I would get these calls that I'd been waiting for weeks. And then, I was never in a great situation to actually take the call, but it was like my only opportunity. So I'd sit there and write notes as fast as I could. And just really, so it was a blessing in all of the different ways that it happened. Sometimes I got to sit down and have very long conversations in person, which was amazing. And all of it really mattered. And now that the book has come out, those that were a little bit more hesitant to be interviewed at first have been so supportive. And I think now that they see what the book is actually about and that I've gained their trust, and I'm really honored that I've made them proud and that they now endorse the book.
Oh, that's so great. Because I did start to think about it, because there's a lot of people who are personally connected in a profound way. And
this is very recent history.
It is very recent history. And, like I said, even for me, I mean, as far removed as I may seem like I am on the outside, I mean, there's a way in which these three figures have huge importance in my life.
Absolutely.
And so you multiply that, against another hundreds, millions of other people. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about your own mom, and just kind of what was she like to inspire you to be able to take on a project like this and to put it all together.
She is.
I talk about my mother in both tenses too.
Was and is. She's so wonderful. It's been obviously so influential for me to be my mother's daughter, and especially on this book tour. And I talk so much about motherhood. Of course, I've been spending so much time reflecting on how she influenced me and what I'm carrying forward that she, had in her heart long before she was thinking of having children as well. She's always been somebody who told me that I could do anything that I wanted to do in the world. She had that same thing that Alberta, Burtis, and Louise did of informing their children on the realities of what they were going to see outside of their home, to not be ignorant to that, but to not be limited by other people's myopic vision of what's possible for me and for my life. I should say also, my mom is a white woman, and she was an incredible ally from the moment. From every time, everything I can remember, she always really understood the importance of allyship, which something I took for granted for many years. I didn't realize that it could be so complicated for other people because my mom was so good at it. And just to give an example, she never said to me, I know what it's going to be like for you to walk through the world as a Black woman. That would have been a crazy statement. But
Right.
instead, she said, I will walk with you. I will learn with you. I will do everything in my power to make sure you're treated with the respect and the dignity that you deserve to be treated with. And I'll make sure that you know through my love what you are worthy of. And you're worthy of all of the opportunities that everybody else is. And she said, I'll do my part, without saying, I know what it's like to walk in your shoes. That's allyship. That's really what we're asking for. And there's so much connection that can come from that really simple notion. I don't know what it is like to be you, but I will walk with you and I'll do my part.
Yeah, I love that. And it's funny because you talk about Burtis as just kind of like the love that she had, that constant like base note of love. And no matter what was going on in her life, I mean, it's remarkable that she could respond to what life gave her with so much love and compassion.
Yeah.
And that reminds me so much of like the way you describe your mom. I mean, one of the things for me that was hardest was we had Andrew Solomon, who wrote Far From the Tree. He's an author 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about his latest project was called New Family Values. So it's an audiobook right now, but he's turning it into a print book. But the most horrifying story in it, I asked him about it, and for me too, or one of the most memorable things he wrote about was about women who were having their children taken away from them by state agencies, child welfare agencies. And that was exactly Louise's situation, where Louise's husband is an activist and is murdered by white terrorists. And then, of course, she's like at the end of her rope, she's got so many children. And then the state starts intervening and taking away her children.
Yeah.
And I think Andrew Solomon and I both didn't realize how prevalent that still is today. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. And when we think of racism, we may not be thinking about that form of racism.
Yeah, it's something that, often comes up when we think about, especially women of color and our welfare system, and how so often it feels that when women are being given the supports that they have every right to, that they then feel that they're now being treated as less than, or they're being disrespected, that they're not being treated with dignity, that someone now can invade their privacy whenever they want to, and that they're kind of looked down upon by the system. So this comes up a lot in testimony from women who, again, are receiving the supports that they are entitled to. But to this day, this continues to be an issue. And there is something really complicated with a system that is in place to help, but instead is making many feel like they're being judged and are not being treated equally or with respect. And so this is definitely something that Louise Little felt when her husband was murdered, and she's taking care of her 8 children. She's a single mother of 8 in her 30s. And she's a Garveyite, though. This also is important to remember. She believes in self-sufficiency, and her pride is very important to her, and not relying on who she sees as her oppressor. And so when welfare workers are coming into her home and really disrespecting her, which they are, they're telling her that she's not a good enough mother, that she shouldn't have had so many children, that the way her kids are reacting to the tragedy of losing their father, she's to blame for all of it. So for instance, Malcolm had turned to shoplifting, etc. And so they're blaming this on Louise, saying you're not capable of taking care of them. And so she responds. Again, she's this very well-educated woman, multilingual, knows her worth, and is not saying that she's going to accept being spoken down to. And so she says and stands up for herself. You are going to respect me in my household. And as a result of this, a white male doctor was sent to her home and diagnoses her with dementia, actually, as a result of him saying that she is, and this is in the doctor's note, quote unquote, imagining being discriminated against. This was enough for her to be put away for 25 years against her will in an institution. He diagnoses her with dementia praecox, and her children are then taken from her, very tragically. And it's up to the state whether or not they get to see her at all. So there's these letters that go back and forth that say, no, the children cannot come see their mother. Her youngest at the time was 8 months old when he was taken from her.
Yeah, that is such a heartbreaking story, and part of it is that she's Grenadian. I mean, so like her international view. I mean, that's what makes it even more heartbreaking, is that she has an image of Black people being respected in her world, and to come here and yeah, I would love to hear her voice. I would love to hear her. You know, I just wonder what her like. Did she speak with an accent?
I believe so. I mean,
yeah.
she was born and raised in Grenada. She was well aware, though, of the ills of white supremacy. She knew about the colonization of her people. Grenada doesn't gain independence until I want to say like the 60s. It's a very long fought battle. And so she's well aware, especially also because of her grandparents being these liberated Africans who understood slavery as well. So coming to the US, as much as it's a little different, she sees so much of the remnants of this colonizing mindset. And that's what she's not willing to accept. And why she so desperately wanted to be a part of this international movement. So she's just well aware of it. And this is why she just cannot bow down, and she won't stop. And even in some of the doctor's notes that are written about her during her 25 years at the Kalamazoo mental institution, they say she's incredibly resistant. She continues to resist us. She continues to resist us. And I read that as like a sentence that reminds me so much of "Nevertheless, she persisted."
Yes.
Very similar. And she keeps fighting for those 25 years that she's in there for her release, and states again, I am not imagining things. She may very well be depressed. That would make a lot of sense. But to diagnose her with something that's completely wrong is just something that, she had no choice in the matter.
And, and then you get to Malcolm X, who's so international in his perspective, writes about that trip of going to Mecca and what it's like to see people from all nations in the world working together as brothers and sisters. And that wasn't just something that happened at Mecca. It was like something that happened. And that's where your book helped me so much. One of the things that I was so interested in, I wasn't as aware of it, Berdis's letters to James Baldwin. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about those letters. Like, are they published somewhere? And what are some of the things that you remember out of the letters?
Yeah, I wish I could have seen more of them, honestly, because really, truly, I heard so much about the letters. They came up all the time in the interviews. They came up a lot in even some of the writing that other loved ones of James Baldwin had written about Burtis. So everyone who mattered to James, he introduced to his mother. So that's why we even have testimony from Maya Angelou writing, I had to bow to half my height to kiss Burtis on her forehead. So Burtis really took in every one of James Baldwin's friends, partners. She cared so deeply about her children and their connections to everybody beyond their home. And so there's a few letters that you can see online at the National African American Smithsonian. They have a great, obviously archival on all this data that they've scanned, and you can see some of the letters online. But beyond that, it's kind of just a mystery as to how beautiful these letters were. I just kept hearing they were beautiful. They were beautiful.
Well, and even you mentioned like that annual birthday letter. Like, gosh, I mean, like it's not too late for anybody who's a parent out there to start writing that. Even for your newborn in August, you can write the first letter then, and. But that idea of having a yearly letter, and the idea of James Baldwin loving language, loving his mom so much that he's looking forward to that, like the best thing about having your birthday is that you get that letter from your mom.
And what she says each year that's maybe different in some of the similar themes that she brings up. And actually before the pandemic, I just remembered I was supposed to travel to see one of his sisters, and she has some of the letters. And then everything, of course, got shut down. So we weren't doing any in-person interviews, but that is something I could follow up on. Is actually getting to see the letters.
I mean, even if you were the editor for the book, I would definitely buy your book of the letters that James Baldwin.
Second edition.
Yeah, there's always new projects. One of the things that I have, I'm so far behind relative to you. That was like what I felt like over and over in reading things, is what I have a very shallow knowledge of, so deeply. But Alex Haley's Autobiography of Malcolm X, how does Malcolm X's life look different to us now than it does just on the basis of that book?
That's a great question. It's so interesting. I mean, In Alex Haley's autobiography, there is a section on Louise at the very beginning that talks about her being pregnant with Malcolm X. Yeah, and she's confronting the KKK. Well, it was actually the Black Legion. It was a different white supremacist group. It's just easier for us to say KKK now because we're more familiar with them. But that she's standing up to them and shows really like her courage, etc. But then that gets very reduced into, and she went crazy and so sad her children were taken away from her. And that's like, it doesn't even make sense now that we think about that summary of who she is, because she goes from being this warrior to then all of a sudden just something happened and we all just kind of say, oh, that's too bad luck kind of thing. And then there's a little bit at the very end where we hear about Malcolm X. It's actually like after the chapters. It's like, I think in the epilogue, where he has been reunited with his mom after she's been released from Kalamazoo after 25 years. And he talks to Alex Haley about how conflicted he'd been about speaking about his mother before, because he was in so much pain that he'd been taken away from her, and how much he loved her, and how he was really coming to terms with how what had happened to her fit so clearly with what he was fighting against in terms of racist and sexist treatment in the United States, et cetera. So there is a little bit in there that I think when you read my book, you could go, and the Autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley is one of my favorite. I mean, it's such a beautiful work. I mean, it's really, really beautiful. But I will say, after you read my book, you can go back to it and you'll start to see these traces of Louise more so throughout the book. And she's there. She's been there all along. We just weren't seeing her. So it's really, a lot of it is revisiting it with a new perspective. It's similar with James Baldwin's works, especially. He actually does mention Burtis more than people really noticed before, because he also talks about his abusive stepfather. A lot of people who are fans of James Baldwin, that's who they know much more in their own memory, that this abusive stepfather is what influenced him, he was sort of in response to this abusive stepfather.
Those stories are horrible. I mean, they're
horrible.
So,
versus the mother who's there day in and day out, loving him, caring for him. But again, if you then go back to the works, you'll start to see how he is honoring his mom in some ways. We just haven't been paying that close of attention to the ways in which they're honoring their moms, because there are these traces that maybe to the sons, they were like, oh, obviously this is my mom. But because we lost their moms' names in history, it seems like these things are just happening randomly, but it's actually very connected to things that their mothers
just talk about how similar Malcolm and his mom were in personality. If you're a woman acting like Malcolm X to the social workers who come to your house, do you know what I mean? There's going to be a problem, Yeah. It does help so much to, like, all these kind of mysterious things that you didn't even realize were mysteries. It definitely raises them up.
Yeah, I think a great example of that is Malcolm X and the dictionary story.
Yes.
Something that all of us that are fans of Malcolm X are like, that is so cool that he wrote word for word from the dictionary, but it's related to the fact that his mom, every time that her kids came home from school, she'd sit them down at the kitchen table. She had newspaper clippings from different newspapers around the world, again, documenting this global movement that they were a part of. And then if they didn't know any of the words, they'd have to go and look it up in the dictionary and come back and continue their reading. This was something she did very intentionally. And so when he's in prison and he's considering converting to the nation, he writes to his brother and says, Mom is the first one to have taught us all of these things. Mom introduced us to this. All of our accomplishments are our moms. And then his brother writes back and says, remember what mom used to do. Remember what mom taught us. And this is why he pulls out the dictionary and starts writing word for word. It wasn't just all of a sudden he thought, I'm going to do that. It's a return to his mother. So these are the kinds of things, for those who haven't read the book, that we're saying, you don't know why they're doing things. And then you go back and read this and it all makes a lot of sense. Not that we even thought we had to make sense of that. We just thought that was a cool fact before, but now we realize it was an incomplete story.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of how many things you've learned about how much you know about Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctoral program.
Yeah.
And how much do you know about his mother? And what does he get from his doctoral program? And what does he get from his mother? I mean, it's just like, of course, you're going to see these figures in such completely different ways. But yeah, so I need to tell everybody, I need to tell you, I didn't even tell you this. We have a tradition of taking questions. So our viewers will send questions via text to me. And so if you have a question, then let Rebecca know, and then I will share the questions with you. Oh man, there's so many questions coming in. But one of the things I before the questions come in, I wanted to ask you about was the Serena Williams being Serena. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah. Oh man, I can't wait I want to ask you about it so badly. I mean, here's a woman who's, has, a crisis in giving birth and almost dies. To hear it in her own words too is just, maybe that's the next project. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I do write about Serena Williams and Beyonce when I'm speaking about the mental health crisis. Yeah. And it reminds us very clearly of the remnants of bias in the system, and in my understanding and study of history, it's not so that we can just sit and think these are interesting facts in history, but instead, because it can provide a lot of healing for us right now. I think it's really important to know what has led to where we are, because then we can actually address it. There is an issue with historical amnesia, and we're not going to be able to move forward unless we understand how to address the pain of the past. You can't find forgiveness if no one, I mean, you can try your best to find forgiveness, but if no one is even acknowledging what hurt you or what pain happened or how we're seeing remnants of it to this day, it's very difficult for us as a nation to move forward. And so I do hope that this book can contribute to those conversations of healing, because especially with the Black maternal health crisis, it is so clearly connected all the way back to the way women were treated in slavery.
Yeah. One of the things I keep thinking about is just the faith of these women. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because it just seemed like such a reservoir of strength for them when they had every reason to despair. They're deeply, deeply connected to their faith.
Yeah. It's something I think about all the time is Black motherhood and our ability to focus on the future, because we can't accept what's readily available to us right now. So even visualizing, having your child right next to you and holding them. This is biological and non-biological. It's community mothering. It's caring for all of these people and just having this sense of, I want to protect this being with everything that I have, but I'm aware of all of these things that could come up against them and what could happen to them. And I can't accept that that's how the world will always be. So instead, we're focused on this possibility for the world that isn't right here with us right now. And that is faith. It's the things you can't readily see and you can't always touch it, but it's possible, it's there, and you believe in that possibility. And that's really almost the only choice that Black mothers have had. We can't just stay right here in this right now. This can't be everything. There has to be more. There has to be a reason. There has to be something we're fighting for and towards. And so that faith is really clear in Alberta, Burtis, and Louise. Definitely with Alberta, especially with her religious faith, with Christianity, and how her family forms this in her, and how she also does this with her children, and with her husband. And similar with Burtis, again, also with her Christian faith. With Louise, it was more so her spirituality. She believed that there was this connection to a higher being, but she wanted her children to be exposed to many different faiths. So it comes up for all of them very differently.
Yeah. No, I totally did. So here's some of the other questions that are coming in. Could you please repeat the name of the movie and book that she referenced at the beginning? So that was...
Hidden Figures.
Which is great. Hidden Figures, and it's about women who are mathematicians who are essential to the space program, but whose stories we lost until we heard that. I loved watching that movie too. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, the author of the book, her name is Margot Lee Shetterly. And so the movie is based off of the book. The movie is very different than the book. In the movie, the women are all like friends and knew each other well. That's actually not the case in real life, but both are such beautiful works of art that I recommend both reading it and watching the film.
Yeah, that's great. And the next question is, none of these women sought formal recognition outside their homes and social structures, would not have supported in any way. We have very few of their own words. Yeah. Will social media fill in the gaps for future almost forgotten women? What a great question.
I love that question. And I actually say that all the time. There are some things that we have available to us now that Alberta, Berdis, and Louise did not. And I think, a lot of people will say, so how do we address this erasure moving forward? What should we do? What would you recommend? I think that there are layers to it. And I'll start with the individual layer. I believe that mothers and Black women and Black mothers should not necessarily say or be okay with being in the background. And that's, again, not to say that we shouldn't be humble. Humility is an important value, but it's also okay for us to say, I had something to do with that.
Yeah.
It's a disservice to our children and to everyone around us if they're not aware of the contributions we've made. And so we have an ability to have more control over our self-definition. We have more means to communicate our story. And I think there's so much healing in sharing our stories with each other. So yes, I think social media can help a lot in terms of just somebody having control over how they're going to be seen. And I think that's really, really cool. But I also think that then it goes beyond that. I'm not the kind of person who says, oh, well, if women just felt more empowered, then they would be more empowered. That's not true. There are very many challenges in place that, if a mother feels unsupported, it's not just a feeling. She's not being supported. We saw this during the pandemic, how so many women, and especially women of color, were forced to leave the workforce because they had to choose either between being mothers or working. That's not something they're imagining. That's a reality. There wasn't a net in place to catch them. So, beyond the individual and our feelings and our ability to control what people might see about us, there are these larger systems in place that are contributing to the lack of support and protection that we need. And so I think that they can work in tandem with each other, that kind of individual, no longer accepting being treated as a second-class citizen, but also how does that translate into policy, and how can others join us in fighting for that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think everybody who's watching has a sense for what Beyonce's pregnancy and having children was like, as Beyonce as a mom, or Serena Williams as a mom. But there's so many stories out there, and you're right. I would have loved to. I would follow Berdis Baldwin on social media, and everything she produced, if she would share what her letters were, that would
have been very cool. We would have had so many cool quotes from her. I feel like,
I totally agree.
With these beautiful quotes.
So here's the next question. Speaking of international exposure, speak about the many countries where you lived and how those experiences have influenced your view of the world.
Oh, thank you for that question. So my parents were both lawyers, and they wanted us to have an international experience as much as possible. So we grew up with the incredible privilege of traveling from place to place, we being my older sister, older brother, and I. And so my parents really prioritized that. So even if, they were doing really well at whatever school they were teaching at, university they were teaching at, if there was a place that we'd hadn't traveled to before and there was a job opening, they would take it so that we could go and see another place. It was something I always really loved. It wasn't always something my brother loved, for instance. So it definitely depends on the kid. He was always really sad every time we left somewhere. He was missing his friends, etc. I was very excited to meet new friends. So there's definitely those different perspectives, but it influenced us in every way possible. I really truly believe my siblings and I just have a really clear understanding, one, of media literacy, for instance, even to the extent of we can't just always believe what's being shown to us, because there were so many things throughout our childhood that someone would say something about a place that we'd actually lived and we thought, that's not an accurate portrayal. Or even thinking about how different it was for me to learn about the Mexican-American War when I was in Mexico versus when I moved back to the States. And then I had a very clear understanding of the storyteller and how crucial the storyteller becomes. And you have to always question who is telling you something and why, what their goal is. So I've never been someone who just readily accepts information. I'm always thinking, okay, what are the motivations behind that? What are the sources behind that? That's really crucial, especially in a time right now with so much disinformation. And it's very hard to sift through a lot of the jargon.
And that Mexican-American War is a great example. I mean, what a horrible thing that the United States got involved in.
And to think of who the heroes are going to be in the story, depending on what side you're hearing the story from. So for me as a child, I had this quick realization of, whoa, That is a completely different story. And what that did for my own mind and my ability to really think for myself was crucial. And beyond that, I mean, even in my interpersonal relationships, I can talk to anybody, and I love talking to everybody because we were the new kids every
Always
couple
the
of
new
years.
kid. I know how that was. I was the new
So
kid
much
too.
confidence. Yeah, you have to just be able to go into a room and just you're good. You're going to be fine. And then I'll also say that it really influenced my not only recognition of difference, but my celebration of difference. I think difference is so important, and also comfort with difference. There are many of us who have been kind of tricked into thinking that difference is scary, or we shouldn't say, oh, you have a different experience than I do because of the color of your skin or whatever it is. That there's nothing to lose by admitting that's fact.
Yeah,
And what
exactly.
can we gain from those strengths of difference is an important thing to focus on. Even in my DEI consulting, that's all about the teams that people are trying to form, is because there's such a strength in different perspectives. And we have to find not only comfort with that, and definitely not just tolerance of that, but celebration of that difference.
Yeah, so true. So true. And it's funny. That's what really sets Malcolm X apart, and why James Baldwin is so attracted to Paris, to have a different take on everything. Because if your only reality is the American reality, then it's an impoverished picture of what's really true. Okay, so here's the next question. Louise retaught her kids every day when they came home. Some generations later, pause. Some generations later, what do you anticipate reteaching your own children?
Wow.
The Mexican-American War, that's a good one. That's a first one.
There's one. Oh, that's such a good question. And so one of the reasons I really love that story about Louise is because I'm a sociologist, and when we think about societies, the first society is the family. Truly, it's the society that we're modeling within our home. And so you're always thinking about, okay, if I believe that this is something, the way the world should work, how am I embodying that in my family? And parents, as the heads of households, how are we embodying that society of what we say this is how the world should be? And Louise she really understood that. It was in everything that she did. So when my children come back from the second society, which is like the outside world and schooling and this kind of thing, how do I make sure that it still fits with the ideals of what we believe in terms of how the world should work? And I think it's just that consciousness of being connected to what they're learning, what they're bringing back into conversation with you, and how can you just make sure you're always connected to it so that it doesn't go completely against the society you're trying to build in your own home. So whether that's you believe in inclusivity, or you believe that the division of gender roles should be more equitable, et cetera, just really always constantly thinking, okay, how are we modeling that in our own home? So those are the kinds of conversations I can see myself having with my children, that, especially when it comes to history and the way we talk about who the heroes are. I obviously am always thinking about a different perspective there. And I would want my children to I don't want them to take everything I say as if I'm the authority, but instead the gift that my parents gave me, which is think about this for yourself. Think about what you've been exposed to. Think about the different things I've told you about our family history, for instance, and does that align, or who is in charge of telling that story, and what do you think about that? Do you think that that was an accurate assessment, or are parts of the story missing? So really just like challenging them to ask those questions was a huge gift my parents gave me. They never tried to, I would say, shut off my curiosity. And I asked a lot of questions always. I'm sure that could get really annoying, but they were always there to say, yes, continue to be curious, continue to ask the questions, because that's how you'll be able to really be confident in who you are, and also feel strongly about, the opinions that you're forming. It's not just because I told you that's the case, but instead you've come to a conclusion on your own, and you've made an informed decision. So that mattered a lot to them. And I think it'll matter a lot to me as well.
Yeah, definitely. How did James Baldwin's mother understand his sexuality, and how did she respond to it?
That is such a good question. And it's so interesting because it didn't come up all that much in my research in terms of, whether that was letters that I was able to read, or whether that was, from the perspective of biographers who had written about James Baldwin. So one of these biographies was written by one of his best friends, David Leeming. And that, is kind of applauded as like the biography to read on James Baldwin because they were such close friends and David Leeming knew the family very well, et cetera. And so from that, we know that there were certain concerns that Burtis had about James Baldwin, that he drank, that he cussed, and that he smoked. She did not like those things. She was concerned, and she reminded him that he needed to take better care of himself. She doesn't say anything at all about any concerns relating to sexuality. So my understanding was that she was not homophobic in any way, especially because this wasn't something he hid. He was very open about who he was. And as I mentioned earlier, she embraced all of his friends and all of his partners who she was able to meet in person, outside of those that were in France. In Harlem, they knew Burtis very well. And even at the funeral, everybody was going to greet Burtis because they knew how close her and her son were. So in some ways, I feel like she was very much ahead of her time, that it didn't come up so often. And I also believe that had it been a problem, Baldwin would have written about it, because he was very honest. This is why we always loved hearing from him.
Yeah.
He was very honest about, again, the abuse that he suffered at his stepfather's hands. But on the opposite side, he's dedicating his works to his mother. Even the characters that are based on her, they're always about this kind of loving person. Sometimes he wishes that she stood up for herself more, but never to the extent of she didn't accept me, or she didn't, love me for who I was. And I just think that's something that would have come up. So my conclusion, and my informed conclusion on that, but it's also a guess because I didn't have something that said either way, I accept him because of his sexuality or I do not, is that she did in fact accept him, but she didn't make it a big thing that she talked about all the time.
Yeah. I love the sections in the book where you talk about it, which you just summarized them. But I can just imagine her loving him so much and just recognizing that the way he was, and not feeling like she needed to judge or anything like that. Just caring for him and recognizing that's who he was.
Yeah.
It just absolutely blows me away, but it's like we only have like 2 minutes left.
That went by so fast.
I know. I feel like I just turned up picked up the computer and here you are. But I wonder if you can tell us like what signs of hope you see as these days. And I was grateful that you wrote a little bit about the Trump administration in the end because I felt like it was really important to connect what was happening. We're kind of starting to we have a different take on what the Trump administration means now than we did, a year ago. And I'm glad that you did that to connect where we are. But I wonder if you can just talk about signs of hope that you're seeing these days.
Yeah, I am such a hopeful person. I'm very much an optimist. And I think, every time I'm also somebody though that is very clear on what I think is wrong and what needs to be fixed, but always ending with a sense of hope. And I think one of the things that this book really teaches us is, yes, there has been incredible progress, even though there are things that I very much still relate to in terms of the fears and the challenges that Alberta, Burtis, and Louise faced. It's also very disrespectful, in my opinion, to them for me to act like there hasn't been progress or that there hasn't been incredible change that they were fighting for, and maybe didn't always stay alive long enough to be able to see the effects of that, but I very much do. And so it's really just this pushing forward with, again, that ideal for what's possible in the future and continuing to make that a reality and carrying forward what I believe that they passed on to us. There's so many lessons in just continuing to fight for that vision of equality and justice and to believe that it's possible, because without believing that, it would just be really difficult to do any kind of organizing, changing work. So I think our eyes always have to be focused on that, while also being okay with being critical. I think you can be critical of a lot of the things that you love because you think of the possibility and the potential for them. And I see that very much so in my relationship with our country, having traveled so much and been outside of the US for so long, and even doing my PhD abroad and coming back and forth. I feel like I have a very clear perspective of the US. That is one that is very loving, but also critical because I know what's possible for us.
Yeah. Well, you do an incredible job of articulating that history of despair and the possibility of hope that comes out of it. And what a gift it's been to spend this time with you. I really appreciate you being on our show today, and I really appreciate your calling as a scholar and as somebody who brings people together and helps us to realize, what possibility we really do have as a society.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and for everyone who tuned in and for your questions. I'm really honored.
Please join me on June 7th at the next forum, when my guest will be Lenny Duncan, author of the new memoir, United States of Grace, a memoir of homelessness, addiction, incarceration, and hope. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give at gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK to 76278. And thanks again, Anna Malaika Tubbs. We're so grateful for your work, and we're looking forward to seeing what you produce in the future.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and happy Mother's Day again.
Yes, happy Mother's Day to everybody.